All right, so today we're diving into some bold ideas about Homeland Security.
Yeah.
We're talking about the conservative vision for DHS.
Yeah.
And to do that, we're going straight to the source, a chapter from Mandate for Leadership.
Right.
This book is basically their playbook for, reshaping the government.
Absolutely.
And let me tell you, they don't hold back.
No, they don't.
So
It's really striking right from the beginning how they frame this whole issue.
yeah.
This isn't just about, tweaking things here and there.
Right.
This is about a complete overhaul.
Really?
They actually come right out and say, dismantle the Department of Homeland Security.
Dismantle. Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
Why blow it all up? What's the logic there?
Well, they argue that after 20 years, DHS just hasn't lived up to its promise. They say it's become a bloated bureaucracy, bogged down in inefficiency,
Okay.
and that it hasn't truly achieved this goal of integration.
So it's like they're saying, this whole experiment with DHS, time to hit the reset button.
Exactly. And for them, that reset button involves splitting DHS up
Okay.
and scattering its functions to different parts of the government.
Interesting.
So, for example, they propose taking CBP, Customs and Border Protection,
right.
merging it with ICE,
Okay.
Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and even pulling in pieces from Health and Human Services and the Justice Department
Oh, yeah.
to create this entirely new agency.
A brand new agency solely focused on border security and immigration.
Exactly.
That's a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
And a huge concentration of power. What would that even look like in practice?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
They envisioned this new agency as a powerhouse,
Okay.
laser-focused on enforcement.
Okay.
Think stricter border control. A more hardline approach to immigration.
Yeah.
And a significant shift in how those policies are implemented.
It definitely makes you think about the potential consequences of such a dramatic restructuring.
Absolutely.
Both, the intended ones and then the unintended ones.
Right, and those are important to consider.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, they do acknowledge that dismantling DHS
Yeah.
might be a long shot politically.
Right.
So they offer a plan B,
Okay.
a whole slew of reforms to implement if DHS stays intact.
Okay.
But even these reforms represent a pretty dramatic departure from the status quo.
Okay, so less of a demolition and more of a renovation.
I think that's a fair way to put it.
So what's at the top of their to-do list if DHS sticks around?
Well, their vision boils down to a smaller, more agile department
Okay.
with a laser focus on a few core functions.
All right, so what are we talking?
Border security and immigration enforcement. That includes a heavy emphasis on detention and deportation,
Okay.
as well as cybersecurity and protecting critical infrastructure.
Okay.
And they also want to see a much more limited role for the federal government in disaster response.
So instead of trying to be the Department of Everything, they want DHS to focus on what they see as its absolutely essential functions.
Exactly.
Streamlining, prioritizing that makes sense on the surface.
Yeah.
But it also raises a ton of questions about what gets left behind.
Right.
What does it even mean in practical terms to, as the chapter puts it, thoroughly enforce immigration laws?
Right.
And what happens when a hurricane slams into the coast? Does a limited federal emergency response really cut it in those situations?
Those are exactly the kinds of questions we need to grapple with.
Yeah.
Because while this chapter lays out a very clear vision in terms of goals,
Right.
it leaves a lot of those practical questions unanswered.
Okay, so big picture. They want to either dismantle DHS or significantly reshape it.
Yeah.
But it gets even more granular than that.
It does.
They actually go agency by agency,
Right.
offering up a kind of report card and a list of proposed changes.
A blueprint for change.
Where do they even begin?
Well, Customs and Border Protection,
Right.
CBP, the agency responsible for securing our borders, is a big one.
Okay.
They argue for more resources.
Okay. More technology, more personnel, but also a return to some more traditional methods, like, believe it or not, horseback patrols.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Horseback patrols, like something out of an old Western movie.
Right?
Are we talking about bringing back the Wild West at the border?
You have to admit it's a striking image.
It is.
But they argue that in certain terrains, particularly along the southern border,
Okay.
horses are more effective than vehicles.
Interesting.
It's about adapting tactics to the specific challenges of the environment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what other surprises they have in store.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they also want to standardize detention standards nationwide.
Okay.
Which they say would allow for more flexibility in using things like,
And what?
wait for it, tent facilities to house detainees, tent cities for people caught crossing the border. That's a pretty controversial idea, to say the least.
To put it mildly.
Yeah.
Their argument is that different detention standards across states create logistical nightmares.
Okay.
And drive up costs.
Okay.
Whether that justifies using tent facilities.
A whole other conversation.
upset.
Definitely a topic for further exploration.
Right.
But we're just scratching the surface here.
We are.
What about ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement?
Right.
They tend to be at the center of a lot of these debates.
Absolutely. And this chapter doesn't shy away from that.
Okay.
In fact, they double down.
Okay.
Calling for stricter enforcement of immigration law,
Okay.
increased detention space, and a greater focus on both immigration-related crimes and any other criminal offenses committed by undocumented immigrants.
Okay, so a more hardline approach across the board.
Yeah.
What about the agency that handles things like green cards and citizenship applications? I believe it's called USCIS, right?
Right, USCIS.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do they have to say about that whole process?
They definitely don't gloss over USCIS. They actually want to see a pretty fundamental shift in how that agency operates.
Interesting.
They envision USCIS returning to its roots as primarily a screening and vetting agency
Okay.
with less emphasis on granting asylum
Okay.
and a much stronger focus on identifying fraud.
Interesting.
They even go so far as to propose a new denaturalization unit.
Wait, a unit specifically dedicated to revoking citizenship?
Yeah,
That seems like a pretty significant change.
it is. And it really highlights their belief that citizenship has become too easy to obtain
Okay.
and that fraud is more widespread than acknowledged.
Okay.
It represents a fundamental shift in how they view the process of becoming an American citizen.
Wow. Okay, so they've covered border security,
Yeah.
immigration enforcement,
Yeah.
and the citizenship process.
Right.
What about FEMA?
Yeah.
You know, the folks who show up after natural disasters?
Right, FEMA.
What's their take on disaster preparedness and response?
They don't mince words about FEMA either.
Okay.
They believe disaster preparedness and response should be primarily the responsibility of states and localities,
Okay.
arguing that FEMA has become too central to the process.
So it's like they're saying, hey, states, you're on the front lines. Step up your game so the feds don't have to...
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But what happens when a disaster is so big that it overwhelms even the best prepared state? Who steps in then?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And it gets at their larger critique of what they see as an overly centralized federal government.
Okay.
They believe many functions currently handled at the federal level
Yeah.
would be better managed by states and localities.
Okay.
But that, of course, assumes those states have the resources and the political will to take on those responsibilities.
Resources and political will, two things that aren't always in abundant supply.
Right.
And speaking of things that might be politically unpopular,
Yeah.
they also take aim at the National Flood Insurance Program.
Right.
You know, the program that helps homeowners in flood-prone areas get insurance.
Right. The NF.
What's their beef with that?
They want to see the whole thing wound down. Really?
They argue that it distorts the market.
Okay.
It encourages people to build in risky areas
Okay.
and ends up leaving taxpayers on the hook for billions of dollars in debt.
So less government intervention, more reliance on the private sector. Are we sensing a theme here?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
This chapter is a very clear articulation of a worldview that favors smaller government,
Okay.
less regulation,
Mm-hmm.
and a greater emphasis on individual responsibility.
Okay, so we've established that this vision for Homeland Security is all about smaller government,
Yeah.
stricter enforcement,
Mm-hmm.
and a major shift in priorities.
Yeah.
But they're not done yet.
No.
They still have a few more agencies to dissect.
Right. We've talked about, securing our physical borders.
Right.
But what about the digital realm? The chapter also has some strong opinions about cybersecurity
Okay.
and the agency tasked with handling those threats.
Okay.
The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or
That's the agency responsible for protecting government networks and critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, right?
Right.
You'd think that would be a top priority in this day and age.
You would think so. And they do emphasize the importance of CIS's core missions.
Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
They have a real bone to pick with CIS's involvement in countering misinformation and disinformation online.
Yes, that whole debate about the government trying to police what we see and read online.
Right.
Things are about to get a little heated, aren't they?
let's just say they don't mince words.
Right.
The chapter calls for an immediate end to any CISA involvement in countering misinformation and disinformation.
Oh.
They argue that it's ineffective,
Okay.
outside the scope of their mission,
Okay.
and potentially even infringes on free speech rights.
So for them, it's a clear case of government overreach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They see it as a slippery slope toward censorship
Right.
and a dangerous expansion of government power.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they even connect it back to the 2016 election.
Okay.
And the claims about Russian interference,
Yeah.
which they call a Clinton campaign dirty trick designed to discredit the Trump administration.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
that's a pretty loaded accusation to throw around,
It is.
especially considering how sensitive that whole topic still is.
It's definitely a point of contention. It's important to note that the chapter doesn't provide evidence to support that claim,
Right.
and it's a highly contested issue.
Yeah.
But it does highlight how deeply these cybersecurity concerns
Right.
are intertwined with broader political anxieties and narratives.
Cybersecurity isn't just about ones and zeros anymore.
Right.
It's become a political battleground.
It really has.
Yeah.
And this chapter makes it very clear where they stand in that battle.
Okay, so they have a lot to say about CISA
They do.
and the perceived dangers of government overreach when it comes to online information.
Yeah.
What about the Coast Guard?
Right.
Where do they fit into all of this?
The Coast Guard might not get as much attention as some of the other agencies,
Right.
but they play a crucial role in Homeland Security,
Yeah.
protecting our waterways, our ports, our coastlines.
It's all under their purview.
It's easy to forget about them until there's a hurricane or a major maritime disaster.
Right.
But they're out there every day patrolling our shores.
Exactly. And this chapter emphasizes the need for a strong and well-equipped Coast Guard,
Okay.
especially in light of what they see as growing threats to U.S. interests on the high seas.
Threats like piracy, drug smuggling.
Those are certainly part of the equation,
Yeah.
but they're particularly concerned about what they call great power competition.
Okay.
Specifically, the challenges posed by China's increasingly assertive maritime presence.
China's been making headlines lately with its activities in the South China Sea.
That's right.
And its growing naval power.
Right.
So it sounds like they want to make sure the Coast Guard is prepared to handle any potential conflicts with China in U.S. waters. That's one way to put it.
Yeah.
They specifically mention the growing threat from the Chinese fishing fleet,
Okay.
which they accuse of illegal fishing in U.S. waters,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the need to counter Chinese influence in the Pacific region.
Okay.
They want to see increased investment in shipbuilding,
Mm-hmm.
maintenance, and upgrades to shore facilities
Okay.
to ensure the Coast Guard has the resources and capabilities to stand toe-to-toe with China if necessary.
So from protecting our digital borders to countering China's maritime ambitions, this vision of Homeland Security is definitely taking shape.
It is.
But before we move on, there's one more agency I'm curious about,
Okay.
the Secret Service.
Right.
You might think protecting the president and other high-ranking officials would be a relatively straightforward mission.
You'd think so, but they actually have quite a bit to say about the Secret Service as well.
Really? What kind of critique could they possibly have of the people who put their lives on the line to protect the president?
It's not about their bravery or their commitment.
Okay.
They fully acknowledge the sacrifices made by Secret Service agents.
Okay.
Their main critique is that the agency is distracted and overextended by its dual mission.
Dual mission. I thought their job was pretty much just to protect people.
Right.
What else do they do?
Well, aside from protection, the Secret Service also has a long history of investigating certain types of financial crimes.
Financial crime. Wait, isn't that the FBI's job?
It is, primarily.
Yeah.
But the Secret Service has always had a role in investigating certain financial crimes,
Okay.
particularly counterfeiting.
Interesting.
That goes back to their roots in the 19th century.
Yep.
Over time, that role has expanded to include things like electronic financial crimes and cybercrime.
So they're basically a hybrid agency, part bodyguard, part financial crimes unit.
Right.
That does sound like a lot to juggle.
Exactly. And this chapter argues that this dual mission has led to a lack of focus.
Okay.
And as a result, a series of security failures and embarrassment.
Really?
They point to a 2015 bipartisan report from the House Oversight Committee
Okay.
that highlighted dozens of security lapses by the Secret Service
Ah.
and called for major reforms.
Okay, so it's not just armchair quarterbacking on their part.
No,
There's a real concern here that the agency might be spread too thin.
precisely. And their proposed solution is to streamline the Secret Service by transferring all non-protection related investigations to other agencies like the Department of Justice or the Department of Treasury.
So basically, they want to refocus the Secret Service on what they see as its core mission, protecting people.
And by doing so, they believe the agency can improve its performance, boost morale, and ultimately ensure the safety of those it's entrusted to protect.
Streamlining, refocusing, those words keep popping up.
Yeah.
It sounds like a recurring theme in their vision for the entire government, not just DHS.
You're picking up on a key point here.
Yeah.
This chapter isn't just about Homeland Security in isolation.
Right.
It's part of a larger argument about the proper role and scope of the federal government as a whole.
Okay.
They see a government that's become too big, too bureaucratic, and too involved in areas that they believe should be left to the states, localities, or the private sector.
So it's about more than just rearranging the boxes on an organizational chart. It's about fundamentally changing the relationship between the federal government and the American people.
Exactly. And that brings us to a crucial question.
Okay.
What would this vision of Homeland Security actually look like in action?
Right, because we've covered a lot of ground here, agency by agency, proposal by proposal.
We have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how does it all fit together?
Right.
What's the end goal?
Ultimately, they envision a DHS with a much smaller footprint,
Okay.
fewer employees, fewer offices, a significantly reduced budget.
Wow.
They believe the department should be streamlined
Okay.
with less bureaucracy, clearer lines of authority, and a laser-like focus on what they see as its essential functions.
So leaner, more agile, more efficient.
Right.
We've heard those words before.
Yeah,
But efficiency doesn't always equal effectiveness, right?
that's right.
And it certainly doesn't guarantee fairness or justice,
Right.
which seem pretty crucial when you're talking about issues like immigration and border security.
You raise a critical point.
Yeah.
They argue that these changes will make DHS more effective
Okay.
by allowing them to focus on their core missions with fewer distractions.
Okay.
But as you rightly point out, effectiveness isn't the only value at stake here.
Right.
How would these changes impact things like fairness, due process, human rights, especially for those most directly affected by DHS policies,
Right.
like immigrants and refugees?
Yeah.
Those are questions that require careful consideration.
And honestly, even if we set aside those really important questions about, potential consequences,
Right.
there's still the issue of feasibility.
Exactly.
Because it's one thing to lay out a vision on paper. It's another thing entirely to actually make it happen.
Yeah, it's a whole other ball game.
Especially when you're talking about dismantling or radically restructuring one of the largest and most complex departments in the entire federal government.
Absolutely.
We're talking about a massive undertaking,
Yeah.
potentially huge costs involved,
Right.
and not to mention the political battles that would inevitably erupt.
Oh, yeah, you can bet on that.
Even if they could somehow get all of these changes through Congress.
Right.
Which, let's be realistic, is a very big if. There's no guarantee it would actually work as intended.
And that's what's so fascinating about this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about, organizational charts and budget lines here.
Right.
We're talking about a fundamentally different vision of what Homeland Security should be
Okay.
and how it should operate.
And perhaps even more importantly, we're talking about fundamentally different visions of America itself.
Absolutely.
Because at its core, this isn't just a debate about bureaucracy or efficiency.
Right.
It's a debate about values,
It is.
about priorities,
Yeah.
about what it means to be safe in the 21st century.
And who deserves to feel safe.
Exactly.
And what we're willing to do or not do in the name of security.
It's about those really fundamental questions that we as a society are still grappling with. And this chapter, for all its talk of agencies and reforms, really lays bare those underlying tensions.
It does, and it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths
Yeah.
about our own assumptions and beliefs.
Like it or not, this vision of a leaner, more enforcement-focused Homeland Security is out there.
It is.
And whether it resonates with you or fills you with a sense of unease,
Right.
it's a conversation starter.
Absolutely.
It's a glimpse into a potential future that demands our attention.
A future that, for better or worse, will be shaped by the choices we make today.
So as you process everything we've unpacked in this deep dive, here's what we want you to consider.
Okay.
What would it actually mean to put these ideas into practice?
Right.
What would be the real-world consequences for individuals,
Yeah.
for communities, for the very fabric of American society?
Because at the end of the day, Homeland Security isn't some abstract concept.
Right.
It's about people.
It is.
It's about lives.
Right.
It's about the kind of country we want to be.
And that's a conversation that goes far beyond the pages of any single book, right, or the proposals of any one political party.
Absolutely.
It's a conversation that requires all of us to engage, to question, and to ultimately decide what kind of future we want to create.
Well said. I think that's a great place to leave it.
That's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.